May 27, 1541. The Tower of London. A 70-year-old woman is led into the mist. No scaffold, no dignity, only a trembling boy with an axe. It would take 11 blows to kill her. This was not justice. This was the collapse of Tudor power. On the morning of the 27th of May, 1541, the Tower of London lay shrouded in thick mist, as if the sky itself had cast a funeral shroud over England. In the inner courtyard, about 150 witnesses stood in silence. They had come to watch what should have been a carefully staged state execution. Instead, they were about to witness chaos, an event that would expose the brutal heart of Henry VIII's reign. The condemned was Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, age 67. Silver streaks ran through her hair, but her back remained straight, her eyes still sharp. She was no common criminal. She was the daughter of the Duke of Clarence, niece of 2 Yorkist kings, once a companion to Queen Catherine of Aragon, and the godmother of Princess Mary. Before her stood not a tall scaffold draped in velvet, but a low, rough block of wood, damp with morning dew, an insult to her rank. Then came the executioner. But he was not the seasoned hand expected for such a task. Accounts describe him only as a blundering, wretched youth, gripping the axe with trembling hands. The fate of a dynasty now rested on his unsteady grip. A guard motioned for her to kneel. Margaret stood firm, and her voice rang out like iron. "So should traitors do, and I am none." The crowd froze. In that moment, she was no longer a prisoner. She was defiance incarnate, challenging the very authority of a king. The axe fell. The first blow missed her neck, striking deep into her shoulder. Blood sprayed across the wet grass. A gasp broke from the onlookers, not from Margaret. And then the unthinkable happened. Margaret ran. At 67 years old, frail but unbroken, she staggered away from the block, fleeing the axe. The scene collapsed into madness. The young executioner chased her, swinging wildly. A second blow, a third, screams rose from the witnesses. This was no ritual of justice. This was a slaughter. It took 11 blows, according to the imperial ambassador Chapuys, before Margaret's body finally fell, hewn into pieces in the most pitiful manner. That morning stripped bare the illusion of Tudor justice. What remained was not majesty, but paranoia, incompetence, and raw brutality. And yet, Margaret Pole did not simply die. She left behind a legacy, a curse of blood, that revealed the rot at the heart of Henry VIII's reign. But how did it come to this? How did one of the wealthiest noblewomen in England, once a trusted figure in the royal household, end her life in such savage chaos? To answer that, we must go back through gardens, councils, prisons, and betrayals to trace the fall of the last Plantagenet. In 1535, at Warblington Castle in Hampshire, the summer sun poured across neatly trimmed gardens. Margaret Pole, now in her 60s, walked with dignity. Her face was stern, her eyes still bright with intelligence. She was not just a noblewoman. She was one of the very few women in 16th century England to hold a peerage in her own right, not through her husband. Under her hand, the Salisbury estates flourished. She was counted among the 5 wealthiest nobles in the realm. But in Henry VIII's England, wealth and bloodline were double-edged swords, and Margaret's lineage, as the last living Plantagenet, made her a threat. One day, her steward hurried to her with a letter sealed in red wax. It bore the hand of her son, Reginald Pole, now abroad on the continent. Margaret opened it, and unease crept across her face. Inside, Reginald denounced Henry VIII, calling him a heretic, urging European monarchs to rise against him. Margaret lowered the letter. Her son had chosen the Pope over the king. She knew then, as Reginald's mother, she could never be safe. The following year, 1536, Henry VIII stormed through Whitehall Palace, pacing with rage. On his table lay Reginald's book. "He calls me a heretic. He wants me overthrown," the king roared. Beside him stood his chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, cold and calculating. He offered to send assassins after Reginald. But Henry wanted more. He wanted Reginald's entire family to pay. Margaret was now in his sights. By August 1538, in Warblington's hall, Margaret's youngest son, Geoffrey Pole, collapsed at her feet, trembling. He had been summoned by Cromwell. Letters to Reginald had been uncovered. Margaret pressed a hand to his shoulder, calming him. "Tell the truth, Geoffrey. We have done nothing wrong. Our loyalty is to the king." But truth no longer shielded them. It had become a blade. By October 1538, Geoffrey, after 2 months in the Tower, broke under interrogation. Before Cromwell's icy stare, he confessed that his brother, Henry Pole, Lord Montague, and the Marquis of Exeter had exchanged letters with Reginald. Cromwell leaned in. "And your mother? Did she know?" Geoffrey sobbed. "She only feared for her son. It was enough." In November 1538, the gates of Warblington opened not for letters, but for soldiers. William Fitzwilliam, Earl of Southampton, read aloud the king's order. "Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, you are arrested for treason." Margaret answered calmly, "I have committed no treason against the king." But she was seized, alongside her teenage grandson, Henry Pole the Younger. Their eyes met, filled with fear. Later, Fitzwilliam would write in astonishment, "We have never seen a woman show such steadfastness, as if she were a man." It was a marvel. Her courage, however, could not save her. In Henry's England, truth was not defined by loyalty, but by the will of the crown. And the crown's will now sat in the hands of Thomas Cromwell. May 1539. In the halls of Parliament, Thomas Cromwell stood before the Lords. In his hands he held what he called undeniable proof, a gown embroidered with the 5 wounds of Christ, a symbol linked to the Catholic rebels of the North. He lifted it high, his voice cold and sharp. This was found among the belongings of Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury. It proves her sympathy for rebellion, her allegiance to her traitor son Reginald, and her loyalty to the Lady Mary against the king. Some lords exchanged uneasy glances. Everyone knew the garment had been discovered 6 months after Margaret was already imprisoned in the Tower. The timing was too convenient. But no one dared to speak. Cromwell's verdict was swift. Margaret Pole requires no trial. A Bill of Attainder shall suffice. With a stroke of ink, a 5-year-old woman was condemned for treason. No witnesses, no jury, no defense. Just as her father, the Duke of Clarence, had once been destroyed by the same instrument 2 generations earlier, history repeated itself. And this time, Margaret was the victim. From her cell in the Tower, Margaret could not defend herself. But words later attributed to her echo the truth. A lie, a fabrication. In this age, truth is what the king declares it to be. "I am condemned, not for what I have done, but for the blood in my veins." She understood this was not justice against a woman. It was a purge against a dynasty. The last Plantagenet bloodline was being erased. And so the question lingers for us today. Can justice truly exist when one scrap of cloth, one manipulated symbol, can determine life or death? If truth itself can be forged, what chance does anyone have against power? May 1539. The iron gates of the Tower of London clanged shut behind Margaret Pole. From that moment, she entered the final 2.5 years of her life, years spent in cold stone and shadow. That first winter, 1539, the cell was damp, bitterly cold. Yet because of her noble rank, Margaret and her grandson, Henry Pole the Younger, just 16 years old, were given food and clothing. They clung to one another, keeping hope alive with memories of Warblington's gardens. But despair seeped in through the walls. By the summer of 1540, news rippled through the Tower. Thomas Cromwell, the architect of her downfall, had himself been arrested and executed by Henry VIII. For a brief moment, Margaret felt hope. If Cromwell could fall, perhaps her fate might change. But the cell door never opened. She remained forgotten in the darkness. That autumn, a servant brought her a warm garment. "From Queen Catherine Howard," he whispered. One small act of kindness, from Henry's fifth wife, a fragile gesture of humanity in a place built for cruelty. Margaret pressed the fabric to her chest, grateful. But by spring 1541, the shadows deepened. Her grandson vanished from his cell. No explanation. Whispers spread he had starved, or been quietly killed. Margaret pleaded with her guards, but they answered only with silence. In her despair, she carved words into the damp stone wall of her cell. Words later remembered as her defiance. "For traitors on the block should die. I am no traitor, no, not I. My faithfulness stands fast, and so I will not to the scaffold go. Christ, in thy mercy, save thou me." Whether those lines were truly hers or legend, they embody her spirit. Even behind iron bars, she refused to wear the name of traitor. And then came the dawn of the 27th of May, 1541. The cell door creaked open. The Tower lieutenant delivered the order. "You are to die within the hour." Margaret rose calmly. "I have committed no treason to deserve death," she said. In the dim morning light, her figure remained unbowed, walking not like a prisoner to her execution, but as if stepping into freedom. The 27th of May, 1541. Morning mist hung over the Tower courtyard, thick as a funeral shroud. The execution was meant to be private, but about 150 witnesses gathered, guards, officials, foreign ambassadors silent, tense, waiting. Before them stood Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, age 67. Straight-backed, dignified, her silver hair loose around her shoulders. She walked with calm steps, refusing to be hurried. There was no scaffold. No velvet-draped platform. Only a low, rough block of wood, wet with dew. For a woman of her rank, it was an insult, the last humiliation. Then, the executioner appeared. Not the skilled Frenchman who had dispatched Anne Boleyn with a single stroke, but a blundering, wretched youth. His hands trembled on the axe shaft. The fate of the last Plantagenet now rested on his unsteady grip. The priest muttered a prayer. A guard gestured for Margaret to kneel. She stood firm, her voice cutting through the mist. "So should traitors do, and I am none." Gasps rippled through the crowd. She refused the ritual of submission. The axe swung. The first blow missed her neck, crashing into her shoulder. Blood spattered the grass. Witnesses recoiled. Margaret did not cry out. Then unthinkably she ran. At 67, frail yet defiant, she staggered across the yard, fleeing the axe. The execution collapsed into chaos. The young headsman chased her, swinging wildly. Blow after blow struck her back, her arms, each one clumsy, each one cruel. Ambassadors later reported it took 10, perhaps 11 strokes before she fell, hacked in pieces in the most pitiful manner. The courtyard echoed not with the solemn dignity of justice, but with horror. A queen's cousin had been reduced to prey in a state-sponsored hunt. As her body lay broken, the mist still clung to the Tower walls. But in that mist, the majesty of Tudor power evaporated, leaving only brutality, incompetence, and shame. Word of Margaret Pole's execution spread quickly beyond the Tower walls. In courts across Europe, shock turned to outrage. The imperial ambassador, Eustace Chapuys, wrote back to Emperor Charles V. "In all Christendom, I have never heard of such cruelty. A woman of nearly 70, chased about the scaffold, and hewn into pieces in the most pitiful manner." Even Henry's own subjects whispered. They had seen Anne Boleyn die, with swift precision, her French swordsman delivering a single, clean stroke. Margaret Pole's death, by contrast, looked like savagery. It was the act of a monarchy lashing out in fear. And what of her family? Her son Henry Pole, Lord Montague, had already been executed. Her grandson, Henry Pole the Younger, vanished in the Tower, his fate never recorded. Geoffrey Pole, the weak link, who confessed under pressure, was eventually released, but broken, disgraced. Her surviving son, Reginald Pole, heard the news in Rome. He was serving the Pope as a cardinal. When word of his mother's death reached him, he was said to be shattered. His enemies claimed he wept for days, blaming himself for her fate. But Reginald did not soften. He denounced Henry VIII with even greater fury, vowing that England would one day answer for her blood. For Henry VIII, however, the purpose was served. With Margaret gone, the last great Plantagenet threat had been erased. He had shown Europe that no bloodline, no lineage, no noble house stood above his will. But the price was heavy. Instead of strengthening his rule, her death stained it. The image of an old woman butchered in the Tower haunted Henry's reign, feeding the whispers of tyranny that followed him to his grave. In that moment, history shifted. Margaret Pole did not die as a traitor. She died as a martyr to conscience and dignity, a symbol of how absolute power corrupts, and how even the mightiest king cannot control the judgment of memory. In the aftermath, Princess Mary Tudor carried a heavy silence. Margaret Pole had been more than a noblewoman to her. She had been her guardian, her godmother, the steady hand who once guided her lessons when her mother, Catherine of Aragon, was pushed aside. When news of Margaret's brutal execution reached Mary, she is said to have wept in private. But she dared not protest. To speak against her father was to invite her own ruin. Instead, she grieved quietly, clutching the memory of the woman who had once defended her against the storm of politics. Mary's silence, however, did not erase her gratitude. Years later, when she became Mary I, Queen of England, she restored dignity to Margaret's memory, recognizing her as a victim of injustice. For Henry VIII, though, the execution did not bring peace. It deepened his paranoia. The king's health was failing, his legs ulcerated, his temper more violent than ever. He saw enemies everywhere, even in shadows, and Margaret's ghost seemed to haunt him. The ambassadors wrote that Henry could not speak her name without anger. In her defiance, she had wounded him more deeply than armies ever could. Even within his own court, unease spread. Nobles whispered of how far the king had gone, striking down a woman of nearly 70, with royal blood, and leaving her body butchered before 150 horrified witnesses. If Henry could destroy Margaret Pole, he could destroy anyone. And so her death did not silence rebellion. It fueled it, an unspoken reminder that power without justice is fragile. Margaret Pole's body was laid to rest within the Tower itself, in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, where so many Tudor victims lay: Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, Lady Jane Grey. There was no grand tomb, no epitaph, only a simple burial in unmarked ground, the memory of her life buried with her. For centuries, visitors to the chapel walked over her grave without knowing. The silence of stone seemed to erase her story, but memory is stubborn. In the Victorian era, when the Tower's chapel was restored, records revealed her name. She was re-identified as one of those buried beneath the floor. A modest inscription was finally placed, acknowledging her as the Countess of Salisbury, executed 1541. By the late 19th century, her memory was transformed again. In 1886, Pope Leo XIII declared her a blessed martyr of the Catholic Church, honoring her steadfastness in the face of tyranny. From silence and disgrace, her name rose once more, carried not by kings or armies, but by remembrance. Today, if you visit the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, you will find a small brass plate bearing her name. Tourists pause. Guides recount her story. And in that quiet moment, the woman once hunted through the Tower courtyard is remembered not as a traitor, but as a martyr of conscience. It is a powerful reversal. Henry VIII condemned her, but history restored her. Margaret Pole's death was not just the end of one woman. It was the breaking of a ritual, the collapse of an illusion that power was orderly, dignified, inevitable. Her execution exposed the raw truth of Henry VIII's reign, that beneath the polished armor and painted portraits was fear, paranoia, and brutality. A queen could be struck down without trial. A noblewoman of nearly 70 could be hacked apart in front of 150 witnesses, and the so-called justice of the realm could be reduced to the trembling hands of a boy with an axe too heavy to lift. This was not majesty, it was chaos, disguised as law. And yet, in that chaos, something survived. Margaret's refusal to kneel, her words, "So should traitors do, and I am none," echo louder than the axe that sought to silence her. Every dynasty falls, every tyrant dies. But the memory of dignity in the face of terror endures, and it is often that memory, not the king's decree, that becomes history's true verdict. So what remains of Margaret Pole's story today? A brass plate in a chapel, a line in the records, a name whispered as one of the last great Plantagenets, cut down by a Tudor king who feared shadows more than enemies. But history does not end with the axe. It lingers in memory, in legend, in the questions we dare to ask centuries later. What does her death tell us about power? That even a king who called himself absolute could not control the way people would remember. That cruelty can destroy a body, but it cannot erase dignity. That the silence of the grave can still speak louder than the decrees of a throne. And perhaps most haunting of all, if a ritual as sacred as execution could fall apart into chaos, what does that say about the stability of power itself? Margaret Pole's story is not only a Tudor tragedy, it is a mirror held up to every age, including our own. So I ask you, what do you think endures longer? The terror of a king, or the defiance of a woman who refused to kneel?